The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me as I sat hunched over my textbook. My tiny apartment felt like a prison cell, walls closing in with the weight of deadlines and exams. My eyes ached from staring at the pages, the words blurring together in a fog of exhaustion. I needed air. Without much thought, I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, the cool night whispering promises of reprieve. The woods behind my apartment complex stretched like an ocean of shadows, mysterious and inviting. I had walked the trail countless times before, a well-trodden path that cut through the heart of the forest. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier, as if the trees held their breath, watching. The crunch of leaves underfoot was soothing at first. I let my mind drift, my senses dulling as I moved deeper into the woods. That's when I saw it, a faint shimmer off the trail, almost like moonlight catching on water. Intrigued, I stepped off the path, weaving between towering oaks and low-hanging branches. There, in the middle of a glade, stood a mirror. It was massive, oval-shaped, and framed in intricate black metal that seemed to twist and writhe like vines. The glass shimmered unnaturally, a dark, almost liquid surface that reflected the world around it in muted tones. My breath hitched. How had this gotten here? Who would leave such a thing in the middle of nowhere? I approached, the forest around me growing eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. My fingers twitched, itching to touch the glass, to confirm it was real. I reached out slowly, the surface rippling like water beneath my fingertips. Suddenly, the world lurched. A cold force yanked me forward, and I stumbled. No, fell into the mirror. Darkness engulfed me, a suffocating void that seemed to stretch endlessly. My scream was swallowed whole as I tumbled through the abyss. When I finally landed, it was not on the forest floor. I found myself in a world that was both familiar and alien. The trees were twisted caricatures of what they had been, their gnarled branches reaching like claws toward a blood-red sky. The ground beneath me was soft and uneven, covered in something that felt disturbingly like flesh. A sickly fog curled around my ankles, its touch icy. I staggered to my feet, my breaths shallow and quick. This was wrong. Everything about this place was wrong. As I moved, the shadows seemed to move with me, shifting unnaturally. I wasn't alone. Shapes flitted at the edge of my vision, indistinct but menacing. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and distant wails echoed faintly, a symphony of despair that set my teeth on edge. I pressed forward, every step a battle against the rising tide of panic. The landscape seemed to change as I moved, the ground twisting and warping beneath me. Trees melted into grotesque statues, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. A black river cut through the land, its surface crawling with things I dared not identify. And then I saw it. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, loomed in the distance. It moved with an unnatural grace, its elongated limbs bending in ways that defied reason. Eyes, or what I thought were eyes, burned like embers in its featureless face. It was watching me. My stomach dropped as it took a step forward, the ground trembling beneath its weightless stride. I turned and ran, heart pounding as the shadow pursued me, silent and relentless. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air thick and heavy, each step harder than the last. The landscape offered no solace. I stumbled through a field of writhing hands that clawed at my legs, their touch cold and hungry. I crossed a bridge made of bones, the river below writhing with pale, eyeless creatures that reached upward with gaping maws. All the while, the shadow creature followed, its presence an oppressive weight that pressed against my very soul. I don't know how long I ran. Time had no meaning here, each second stretching into eternity. My body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop not with that thing so close. The forest closed in around me, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I fought to stay ahead. Finally, I stumbled into another clearing, my legs giving out beneath me. The mirror stood at its center, a beacon of unnatural light in the suffocating darkness. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. The shadow was there, emerging from the trees with slow, deliberate steps. I scrambled to my feet, every instinct screaming at me to reach the mirror. My hands found its surface, the glass cold and unyielding. The shadow loomed closer, its ember-like eyes burning holes into my mind. Desperation overtook me, and I slammed my palms against the glass. It gave way. I fell forward, the familiar chill of the void swallowing me once more. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the forest, the mirror nowhere to be seen. My body trembled violently, my clothes torn and stained with dirt and blood. The woods were silent again, but the weight of the other world lingered, a specter in my mind. I ran home without looking back, the memory of burning eyes etched into my soul. Even now, as I sit here, safe within the confines of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The shadows seem darker, the silence heavier, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see it, waiting, watching. The mirror may be gone, but I know the door it opened remains. The rookie officer's hands trembled on the steering wheel as his cruiser hummed down the narrow, winding road. The headlights barely cut through the suffocating darkness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance just beyond his vision. The forest loomed on either side, ancient trees with gnarled branches clawing at the night sky like skeletal hands. He could feel the weight of the prisoner's gaze in the back seat, but he didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. Not now, not with where they were headed. The dirt road stretched endlessly, its surface uneven and riddled with potholes that jostled the car and sent jolts up his spine. The air inside the cruiser was thick, oppressive, and carried the faint metallic tang of fear. His own. He had heard the stories before joining the force, whispered rumors of the haunted woods and the monstrous witch that lived within them. He had laughed it off back then, dismissing it as small-town folklore. But now, as the cruiser crawled deeper into the forest's choking darkness, the laughter felt like a distant memory, drowned by the pounding of his heart. The prisoner, a wiry man with unkempt hair and hollow eyes, sat silently behind the metal grate separating him from the rookie. He hadn't said a word since being cuffed and loaded into the car, but there was something unnerving about his stillness. The rookie could feel it, a heavy presence that seemed to grow more suffocating with each passing mile. Just a routine transfer, the chief had said earlier that evening, his voice gruff but nonchalant. Take him to the next county's holding facility. The rookie had nodded, eager to prove himself, unaware of the true nature of his task. Now, as the cruiser's tires crunched over the gravel path, he began to suspect there was more to this assignment than he had been told. The road narrowed further, the trees pressing in like a vice. The rookie's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The darkness outside the windows felt alive, shifting and writhing as if something massive lurked just beyond the beams of the headlights. The rookie's throat was dry, his mouth unable to form words, even if he had dared to speak. A sign emerged from the darkness, barely legible in the dim light. Turn back. The words were crudely painted in red, dripping as though freshly scrawled. The rookie's stomach churned, and he instinctively slowed the car. The prisoner shifted in his seat, the movement slight, but enough to send a fresh wave of unease crawling up the rookie's spine. He tightened his grip on the wheel, forcing the car to keep moving. There was no turning back now. The air grew colder, each breath fogging the windshield despite the heater running on low. The rookie's eyes darted to the woods on either side of the road, searching for something. He didn't know what. A part of him hoped he wouldn't see it, but the other part dreaded the idea of being caught unaware. The cruiser's engine sputtered, coughing as if it too were afraid to continue. The rookie cursed under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. He glanced at the fuel gauge. It was fine. No reason for the car to struggle. Yet it did, as though the very road itself resisted their passage. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A clearing. The road opened up to a circular patch of earth, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed taller and more menacing than the rest. At the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, weathered and stained with dark streaks that the rookie refused to examine too closely. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine, a primal instinct screaming at him to turn around and flee. But he couldn't. He brought the cruiser to a stop, the engine falling silent. The absence of sound was deafening, the forest's usual symphony of nocturnal life conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The rookie sat frozen in the driver's seat, his pulse thundering in his ears. He could feel the prisoner watching him, but he didn't dare look back. A rustling sound broke the silence, faint but unmistakable. The rookie's head snapped toward the woods, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The rustling grew louder, closer, accompanied by a strange clicking noise that set his teeth on edge. It was a sound that didn't belong, unnatural and deeply wrong. And then he saw her. She emerged from the shadows like a nightmare-given form, her towering frame dwarfing the trees around her. 10 feet tall, with 6 spindly arms that moved with a grotesque fluidity, the witch was a vision of terror. Her crimson eyes burned like embers, piercing through the darkness and locking onto the rookie with a predatory hunger. Her legs, long and unnaturally jointed, carried her forward with a deliberate grace that made his stomach churn. The rookie couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only watch as she approached, her movements accompanied by the sickening sound of her legs clicking against the earth. Her face, a twisted mask of malevolence, split into a grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. She was close now, close enough for him to see the dark veins that pulsed beneath her pale, almost translucent skin. The prisoner began to thrash in the back seat, his earlier stillness replaced by frantic desperation. The sound snapped the rookie out of his paralysis, and he fumbled for his sidearm. His hands shook so violently that he almost dropped it. He aimed the gun at the witch, his finger hovering over the trigger. She stopped, her crimson eyes narrowing. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, and then she laughed, a low, guttural sound that rumbled through the clearing like distant thunder. It wasn't the laugh of a human. It was something ancient and otherworldly, a sound that promised pain and despair. The rookie fired. The gunshot echoed through the forest, shattering the oppressive silence. The witch didn't flinch. The bullet struck her chest and fell harmlessly to the ground, as though repelled by an unseen force. Her grin widened, and she raised one of her 6 arms, pointing a long, clawed finger at the rookie. The prisoner screamed. The witch moved faster than the rookie thought possible, her legs carrying her to the cruiser in a single, horrifying leap. The vehicle rocked violently as she landed on the hood, her crimson eyes peering through the windshield. The rookie froze, unable to tear his gaze away from hers. He felt something cold and slimy coil around his mind, probing, searching. It was as though she were peeling away his thoughts, his memories, exposing his very soul. And then she spoke, her voice a guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Leave him. The rookie's hand moved to the door handle before he realized what he was doing. He fought against it, his body trembling as he struggled to resist her command. But it was futile. The door opened, and he stepped out into the cold night, his legs moving of their own accord. The witch's gaze never left him, her crimson eyes boring into his very essence. Behind him, the prisoner's screams reached a fever pitch as the witch tore open the cruiser's door with one of her clawed arms. The rookie didn't turn around. He didn't want to see what she would do. He just ran, his footsteps pounding against the dirt road as the prisoner's screams were abruptly cut off. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering secrets he couldn't understand. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The witch's laughter echoed behind him, a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. When he finally stumbled out of the woods and onto the main road, gasping for air, he collapsed to his knees. The cruiser was gone. The prisoner was gone. And the witch, she was still out there, waiting. The rookie never spoke of that night, but he knew, deep down, that the dark secret of the woods would claim more victims. And the witch, with her 6 arms, 10 legs, and crimson eyes, would never be satisfied. Stress hung on Emily like a second skin, unrelenting and suffocating. Her days as a young lawyer were consumed by endless hours of drudgery, her nights haunted by the constant churn of deadlines and expectations. So when her best friend, Claire, called with an invitation to a haunted hayride, she hesitated. Emily was not one for frivolity, much less Halloween scares, but the thought of stepping outside her usual rigidity was oddly appealing, like testing the boundaries of a cage. "I'll go," she had said reluctantly, already second-guessing the decision. The evening began to unravel the moment she stepped outside her apartment. Her car sputtered and coughed like it shared her exhaustion, before finally refusing to start altogether. She cursed under her breath, calling for a tow and scrambling for a rideshare. By the time she reached the rural outskirts where the hayride was staged, the crisp autumn air was laced with the sharp tang of wood smoke and faint strains of eerie music. Her friends were nowhere to be seen. "They just left on the last ride," said a surly man in a faded skeleton hoodie, pointing toward the distant glow of the hayride's path. "Next one's in 10 minutes. Emily considered turning back, but decided against it. She had come this far. The hayride, after all, was supposed to be fun. She bought her ticket, brushed off the unease creeping up her spine, and waited under the flickering light of a jack-o'-lantern. When the hay wagon arrived, she climbed aboard with only 2 others, a man and a woman seated at opposite ends of the wooden bench. They didn't speak or even glance at her. Their presence was unsettling, too still, too quiet. The man's face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, while the woman clutched a battered purse to her chest, her eyes fixed on nothing. The tractor lurched forward, pulling the wagon into the darkness. The hayride's path wound through dense woods, where skeletal branches reached like grasping fingers. Halloween decorations hung here and there, glowing jack-o'-lanterns, fake cobwebs, and grinning scarecrows. But as they rolled deeper into the trees, the kitschy charm gave way to something darker. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, curling around the wagon like a living thing. The first scene appeared on the left, a dilapidated farmhouse with a blood-smeared door. A man in a butcher's apron stood in the yard, holding a cleaver. He stared at the wagon as it passed, unblinking, his face pale and sickly under the dim light. Emily's stomach twisted when she noticed the blood dripping from his hands looked too real. The wagon creaked and groaned as it moved on. The man and woman beside her remained motionless, their silence now oppressive. Emily hugged herself, her breath visible in the chill air. The next scene was worse. A carnival tent, its red and white stripes faded and tattered. Inside, a clown sat hunched on a stool, sharpening a wickedly curved blade. The sound of metal scraping against stone grated on Emily's nerves. The clown's painted grin seemed to stretch wider as the wagon passed. His eyes followed her, cold and predatory. "This can't be real," Emily whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. The wagon stopped abruptly at the edge of a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit barn, its doors hanging open. Screams echoed from within, high and frantic. Emily's pulse quickened. These weren't the playful shrieks of paid actors, but the raw, guttural cries of people in genuine terror. She froze as a figure stumbled out of the barn. It was Claire. Her friend's face was a mask of agony, her body limp and bloodied. She collapsed to the ground, her eyes locking with Emily's for a fleeting moment before a man in a grotesque pig mask dragged her back inside. The barn doors slammed shut, cutting off her muffled screams. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. She turned to the others in the wagon, desperate for some acknowledgement of what she had just seen. But the man and woman sat unmoving, their faces shadowed and impassive. The driver didn't respond. The tractor began to move again, this time toward the barn. Panic surged through her. She leapt from the wagon, landing hard on the uneven ground. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself to her feet and stumbled toward the nearest cover, a looming cornfield. The stalks closed around her, their rustling whispers amplifying her fear. She ran blindly, the rows stretching endlessly in every direction. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the dry earth. They were coming for her. Her heart pounded as she darted left, then right, desperate to lose her pursuers. Shadows flickered in her peripheral vision. A scarecrow with a scythe, a skeletal figure dragging chains. The boundaries between actor and monster had dissolved. Everything felt horrifyingly real. She tripped over a root, sprawling face first into the dirt. The footsteps grew louder. Emily scrambled forward, her hands clawing at the ground. She didn't dare look back. The cornfield ended abruptly, depositing her at the edge of a shallow ravine. She turned just in time to see them emerge from the stalks. The clown, the butcher, the pig-masked man. Their weapons glinted in the moonlight, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators savoring the hunt. Emily backed away, her heels slipping on the loose soil. She screamed as they closed in, her voice swallowed by the vast, uncaring night. The last thing she saw was the glint of the cleaver descending. The haunted Hayride reopened the following Halloween, its advertisements promising new and improved scares. None of the missing patrons from the previous year were ever found, but the Hayride's reputation grew, attracting thrill-seekers eager to test their mettle. The ticket booth remained busy all night, the line stretching long into the darkness, just as it always did. The rain poured relentlessly as Jacob Hall drove through the winding roads of the countryside, his GPS occasionally losing signal. He was a newly minted realtor, eager to make his mark in the business, and this was his first big opportunity. A mysterious call from a woman named Evelyn Blackwood. Her voice had been soft and velvety, carrying an urgency he couldn't ignore. She wanted to sell her family's estate, a sprawling mansion she described as gothic and historic, and insisted he meet her tonight. When Jacob finally reached the address, he stopped the car and stared. The mansion was enormous, its towering spires piercing the stormy sky like black knives. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and shattered gargoyles loomed over the entryway. The place exuded an air of decay, yet there was an undeniable beauty to its architecture, a haunting allure that sent a shiver down his spine. He hesitated, checking his phone, but there was no signal. With a deep breath, he grabbed his briefcase, flipped up his coat collar against the rain, and approached the front door. Before he could knock, the door creaked open, and a man appeared. The butler. The man's appearance was unsettling. His skin was sallow, and his eyes sunken. He wore a suit that looked decades old, and his thin lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Hall, I presume," the butler said, his voice low and gravelly. Jacob nodded. "Yes, I'm here to meet Miss Blackwood." "Of course. Right this way." The butler stepped aside, motioning for Jacob to enter. The interior of the mansion was as imposing as the exterior. The grand foyer was illuminated by a massive chandelier dripping with crystals, its light casting eerie shadows on the high walls. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallway, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood, and something metallic he couldn't place. The butler led him to a sitting room, where a fire crackled in the stone hearth. And there she was, Evelyn Blackwood. She rose gracefully from a velvet armchair, her movements fluid and hypnotic. She was stunning, with raven black hair that cascaded over her shoulders, porcelain skin that seemed to glow in the firelight, and piercing green eyes that locked onto his. "Mr. Hall," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Jacob felt his throat go dry. "It's my pleasure, Miss Blackwood. Your estate is impressive." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "It has its charm, but it's time for me to move on. The house has become too much to maintain." They sat down to discuss the details, and Evelyn signed the contract with a flourish, her long fingers gliding across the page. Everything seemed straightforward, though Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Perhaps it was the way her eyes lingered on him, or the way the butler hovered just out of sight, always watching. Once the paperwork was done, Evelyn insisted he stay for a drink to celebrate. A crystal goblet filled with deep red liquid was placed in his hand. The firelight danced on its surface, and Jacob hesitated, the metallic scent from earlier now overpowering. But he didn't want to offend her hospitality, so he took a sip. The world spun. Jacob's vision blurred, and his limbs felt heavy. The room seemed to tilt, and he struggled to stay upright. Evelyn's face swam into focus, her smile widening to reveal sharp, glistening fangs. "You shouldn't have drunk that," she whispered, her voice laced with mock regret. Jacob tried to speak, but his words came out as a slurred mumble. Darkness crept into the edges of his vision, and the last thing he saw was Evelyn's hauntingly beautiful face hovering over him. When he awoke, he was in a cold, dimly lit room. Chains bound his wrists and ankles, and the air was damp and stifling. Shadows moved along the walls, and he realized he wasn't alone. Other figures were chained around the room, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They watched him with a mixture of pity and resignation. "Welcome," one of them rasped. "You're one of us now." Jacob's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Before the man could answer, the door creaked open, and Evelyn entered. She looked even more ethereal, her presence dominating the room. She approached Jacob, her emerald eyes glowing in the dim light. "You've joined my collection, Mr. Hall," she said, her voice a purr. "I've grown fond of realtors. You bring such ambition, such hunger." Jacob tried to pull away, but the chains held firm. "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn crouched in front of him, her lips inches from his ear. "Because I can, and because I need you. You'll serve me, just as they do." She gestured to the other captives. "You'll bring me more like you, ambitious, unsuspecting souls to keep my thirst sated." "I won't," Jacob spat. Evelyn's laughter echoed through the room. "Oh, you will. They all say that at first." Before he could protest further, she leaned in, her fangs sinking into his neck. Pain exploded through him, followed by a wave of euphoria. His vision dimmed, and a strange warmth spread through his body. When she pulled away, Jacob's world went black once more. When he awoke again, he was different. His senses were sharper, his body stronger, but his will was no longer his own. Evelyn's voice echoed in his mind, a seductive command he couldn't resist. He stood in the grand foyer once more, dressed impeccably in a suit provided by the butler. Evelyn watched him from the top of the staircase, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You'll do wonderfully, Jacob," she said. "Now go, find me another." And so, Jacob Hall stepped out into the rain, no longer a man, but a servant bound by blood. The mansion loomed behind him, its doors waiting to trap the next unsuspecting soul. The rain hit the windshield in rhythmic taps, the lone college student behind the wheel gripping the steering tightly. Nate's mind was a storm of its own. He'd flunked out of school, his part-time job at the diner had gone under, and now an eviction notice lay crumpled in his backseat, his only possessions stuffed in a battered duffel bag. The envelope that had arrived 2 days ago sat on the passenger seat, its edges worn from his anxious handling. A letter from a distant uncle he'd never met, informing him of an inheritance, an old farmhouse and a sprawling plot of land in the middle of nowhere. Nate had clung to the news like a drowning man to driftwood. A fresh start, a chance to figure things out. The drive stretched on endlessly, the rain turning the gray landscape into a blur of shadows. When he finally arrived at the property, just as the sun was setting, his breath hitched. The farmhouse stood tall and proud against the backdrop of a bruised sky. It was older than he expected, but charming. The wraparound porch sagged slightly, and the windows were filmy with age, but it exuded a strange warmth. For the first time in weeks, Nate felt a flicker of hope. Inside, the house was surprisingly well kept. Dusty, yes, but the furniture was intact, the wood floors sturdy beneath his feet. A fire crackled in the hearth, a detail that made him pause. He hadn't started it. Brushing the thought aside, he chalked it up to the property's caretaker, someone he'd likely never meet. The kitchen was stocked with canned goods, and the bedroom upstairs held a neatly made bed. Everything felt too good to be true. By nightfall, the charm began to fade. Nate noticed the temperature dropped sharply, his breath visible in the air despite the fire he stoked in the hearth. Strange creaks echoed through the house, too deliberate to be settling wood. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, as though reaching for him. He dismissed it as exhaustion and turned in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The bed creaked under him, the sound grating in the oppressive silence. The house groaned with the weight of its age, but Nate couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Something was moving, breathing, watching. At precisely 3:13 in the morning, Nate woke with a start, his body drenched in cold sweat. The room was pitch black, but he swore he heard whispers. Faint, indecipherable, but undeniably there. He sat up, straining to hear, but the sound ceased, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air was heavy, suffocating. He could almost feel it pressing against his chest. He lay back down, forcing his eyes shut. Morning would come. It always did. But the mornings brought no respite. Each night, the house became more sinister. The walls seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, the angles of the rooms subtly wrong. Doors he'd left open were closed when he turned back, and the faint whispers grew louder, though they still eluded comprehension. On the third night, Nate noticed handprints on the dusty windows. They were too large to be his own and smeared, as if something had been pressing against the glass, desperate to get in or out. By the fifth night, Nate was unraveling. The farmhouse's charm was gone, replaced by a claustrophobic menace. The whispers followed him now, echoing in his ears even during the day. The air inside the house was stale, thick with a scent of rot. The shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, curling around his feet like living things. He tried leaving, but no matter how far he drove down the dirt road, it always looped back to the farmhouse. It was as if the house refused to let him go. On the seventh night, the house revealed its true nature. Nate awoke to the sound of the walls groaning, the wood twisting and splintering as if alive. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming in languages he couldn't understand. The walls began to pulse, flesh-like, as if the house were breathing. And then the darkness came. It seeped from the corners of the room, a void that swallowed the dim light of his flashlight. Nate tried to run, but the floor buckled beneath him, the wood curling into claw like shapes that snatched at his ankles. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive blackness. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, skeletal, with hollow eyes that burned like embers. Its movements were jerky, inhuman, as it advanced toward him. "You belong to the house now," a voice rasped, though the entity's mouth did not move. Nate struggled, clawed at the floor, but the darkness wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the house. The last thing he saw was the entity's twisted grin as it reached out with impossibly long fingers and dragged him into the void. When the sun rose the next morning, the farmhouse was as still as ever. The fire crackled in the hearth, the bed upstairs neatly made, and the letter that had lured Nate there lay on the kitchen table, its edges crisp and clean. Somewhere, in a dimly lit room filled with stacks of old papers and envelopes, a hand penned another letter. The ink glistened wetly as the words formed on the page, "To my dearest heir." The first chill of the evening crept along Ethan's spine as he stepped off his skateboard at the cemetery's gate. The ornate iron arch loomed above him, blackened with age and twisted like skeletal fingers clasping at the sky. It was his first night as the cemetery's groundskeeper and security guard. Only 18, fresh out of high school, Ethan's nerves tingled with the weight of his responsibility. He wanted to prove himself, to show he could handle the quiet, eerie solitude of this place. The cemetery was unlike any other he'd seen. Ancient tombstones leaned at odd angles, the inscriptions worn to whispers by time. A mist coiled low to the ground, clinging to his sneakers like the grasping hands of the dead. Ethan inhaled deeply, trying to shake off his unease. He had told himself it was just a job, no different from flipping burgers or stocking shelves. But as the gate clanged shut behind him, the sound echoed with an unsettling finality. He headed toward the small office nestled at the edge of the property, a single bulb casting a feeble glow over its doorway. Inside, The air was stifling and stale, smelling faintly of mildew, and something he couldn't place. Something metallic, like old blood. A row of security monitors blinked to life as he settled into the creaky chair, the static hum filling the silence. At first, the screens showed nothing unusual. Rows of gravestones stretched into darkness, their shadows long and distorted. The occasional flutter of a bat or rustle of leaves caught his attention, but nothing more. As the hours crawled by, Ethan's confidence grew. "This isn't so bad," he muttered under his breath, though the sound of his own voice felt out of place, almost wrong in the oppressive quiet. But then, just past 11 o'clock, the shadows began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of the screen, a shadow that seemed to stretch and move against the grain of the wind. Ethan leaned closer to the monitors, his heartbeat quickening. He told himself it was nothing. The mind plays tricks in the dark. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Midnight struck, and the faint chime of the office's clock seemed unnaturally loud. Ethan's eyes darted back to the monitors. That's when he saw him. An old man, hunched and gaunt, wearing a tattered groundskeeper's uniform, appeared on the screen. His face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat, but the way he moved, deliberate, unnatural, made Ethan's skin crawl. The man walked between the graves, his figure flickering as if caught between two worlds. Ethan's breath hitched. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered, though no answer came. Gathering his courage, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the night. The cold bit at his skin as he walked among the graves, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the mist. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. The tombstones seemed to lean closer, their inscriptions like warnings he couldn't read. He called out, his voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone out here?" The words evaporated into the mist, swallowed by the oppressive darkness, and then he saw it. His skateboard, the one he had leaned against the office wall, was stuck upright in the ground, its nose buried like a gravestone. It stood before an open plot, the freshly dug earth dark and damp. Ethan's heart pounded as he approached, the flashlight shaking in his grip. The grave was empty, a yawning void that seemed to breathe. A sudden force struck him from behind, and he tumbled forward. The air rushed from his lungs as he landed in the grave, his back colliding with something hard and cold. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, its beam casting wild, spinning shadows. He was lying in an open casket. Panic seized him as he scrambled to climb out, but the walls of the grave were slick and unyielding. Above him, the old man's face appeared, pale and sunken, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. The man held a rusted shovel, and a twisted grin spread across his face as he began to toss dirt into the grave. Ethan screamed, the sound raw and primal, but it was drowned out by the thud of earth hitting the casket. The weight pressed down on him, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. The old man's laughter echoed above, a chilling sound that reverberated through Ethan's very bones. Darkness closed in, heavy and suffocating. His vision blurred, his thoughts unraveling. And then, Ethan jolted awake, gasping for air. He was in the office, the monitors glowing dimly around him. His heart raced as he looked around, his hands trembling. It was just a dream, a horrible, vivid dream. He grabbed his skateboard and bolted out the door, the cold night air shocking against his skin. He didn't stop until he reached the gate, his breath clouding in the frigid air. As he turned to glance back at the cemetery one last time, he froze. The old man stood beneath the arch, his hat pulled low, his hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. Ethan blinked, and the figure was gone. Without another second's hesitation, he pushed off on his skateboard, the wheels rattling against the pavement as he fled into the night. Behind him, the cemetery stood silent and still, but the oppressive feeling lingered, as if unseen eyes followed his every move. Somewhere in the distance, faint laughter echoed, carried on the wind. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that seemed to wrap around you like a damp shroud. Mark Edwards gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan, his knuckles white with tension. The divorce papers in his passenger seat felt heavier than they should, like a tombstone for his failed marriage. He had signed them just hours ago, his pen scratching against the paper as if it were carving into his soul. Now he was on the road to nowhere, heading toward the small, unremarkable house he had managed to scrape together after the split. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of black cutting through a landscape of shadows. The only illumination came from his headlights, casting fleeting beams on skeletal trees and the occasional road sign. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. Fatigue was setting in, each blink of his eyes growing longer, heavier. He had planned to drive straight through the night, but his body was betraying him. When the neon sign appeared in the distance, it was like a mirage. It flickered erratically, casting weak, pale light that spelled out Moonlit Haven Motel. Beneath the sign, an arrow pointed toward a gravel lot, dotted with a few parked cars that looked as lifeless as the landscape around them. Mark hesitated, but felt his resolve crumbling. The prospect of a bed, no matter how lumpy or questionable, was better than the risk of falling asleep at the wheel. The motel loomed ahead, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The architecture screamed 1980s, with its wood-paneled exterior and gaudy, oversized signage. The windows on the upper floor were dark, save for one where the curtains fluttered faintly, as if disturbed by a breeze that didn't exist. Mark parked near the entrance and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and carried a faint metallic tang he couldn't place. He grabbed his overnight bag and walked toward the front desk, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulb above the desk buzzing like an angry wasp. The wallpaper was a sickly yellow, peeling at the corners, and the carpet squelched faintly underfoot as if damp. Behind the counter stood a man who seemed to materialize out of the shadows. He was tall and wiry, his features sharp and predatory. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity, catching the light in a way that made Mark's stomach churn. They seemed too bright, too alive, like the eyes of a beast poised to pounce. "Room for the night?" the man asked, his voice gravelly, almost guttural. Mark nodded, fumbling for his wallet. The man's lips curled into what might have been a smile, but it felt more like a baring of teeth. "Room 7, the man said, sliding a key across the counter. His fingers lingered on it for a moment too long, nails slightly longer and sharper than they should have been. Up the stairs, end of the hall. Mark mumbled a thank you and took the key, his skin crawling as he brushed against the man's fingers. He hurried to the staircase, the back of his neck prickling, as if he were being watched. The hallway upstairs was dim and smelled faintly of mildew. The carpet was threadbare, revealing patches of warped wood beneath. Room 7's door creaked loudly as he unlocked it. The room was as dated as the rest of the motel, with garish floral wallpaper and a bedspread that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. The air was stale, carrying a faint, acrid scent that made his nose wrinkle. He set his bag on the bed and turned on the lamp. The weak light illuminated a small, grimy bathroom and a desk with a cracked mirror above it. As he sat down on the bed, his eyes caught something on the wall by the door, a small, dark stain. He leaned closer and felt his stomach lurch. It was red, a drop of blood, smeared slightly as if someone had tried to wipe it away, but hadn't bothered to finish the job. Mark's pulse quickened. He told himself it was nothing, just a careless guest or a long-forgotten accident. But the unease that had settled over him since he arrived refused to dissipate. He locked the door, double-checking it, and tried to convince himself he was safe. The night deepened, and Mark drifted into a fitful sleep, his dreams plagued by indistinct shapes and guttural growls. A sudden, sharp thud jolted him awake. He sat up, heart hammering, and strained to listen. Another thud, followed by a muffled scream, sent icy tendrils of fear crawling up his spine. He stumbled to the window, his hands trembling as he pulled the curtain aside. The parking lot below was bathed in moonlight, empty save for his car and the others that hadn't moved since his arrival. Movement at the edge of the lot caught his eye. A shadow darted past, quick and fluid, too large to be human. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he caught a glimpse of fur and gleaming eyes before it vanished into the darkness. Panic gripped him. He grabbed his bag and unlocked the door, peering into the hallway. It was silent, oppressive. The air felt heavier than before, and a faint growling noise seemed to echo from somewhere below. Mark bolted for the stairs, his footsteps loud in the suffocating silence. As he reached the lobby, the front desk was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the flickering neon sign outside. He pushed through the front door and ran toward his car, but as he fumbled for his keys, he heard it. A low, guttural snarl that froze him in place. He turned slowly, his breath hitching. Standing at the edge of the lot was the man from the front desk, but he was no longer a man. His body was hunched, his limbs elongated and twisted, fur sprouting from his skin. His eyes, those same predatory eyes, locked onto Mark with a hunger that was unmistakable. Mark ran, his legs burning as he sprinted toward the woods behind the motel. Branches tore at his skin, the moonlight barely guiding his path. The snarls grew louder, closer. He didn't dare look back. When he stumbled into a clearing, the moon emerged fully from behind the clouds, bathing the scene in cold light. Mark's chest heaved as he turned to see the creature stalking toward him, its fangs bared and dripping. It was the man. No, the beast from the front desk. Mark's scream was swallowed by the night as the werewolf lunged, its jaws closing around his throat. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the motel in the distance, its neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. The moonlit Haven Motel remained, waiting patiently for its next unsuspecting guest. The Facebook Marketplace ad was unassuming. House sitter needed for one night, $300 cash, Victorian mansion, no pets, easy gig. For Claire, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. 32, single and scraping by, she had no plans for the weekend. The promise of extra cash for a single night of babysitting a house sounded like a godsend. The mansion stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, silhouetted against a pale, dying sunset. Its dark, peaked roofs and ornate gables clawed at the sky. The owners, a charming older couple with kind eyes and warm smiles, greeted her at the door. They showed her around the sprawling house, pointing out their antiques and family heirlooms with pride. The decor was stunning, every room a tapestry of rich colors, intricate woodwork, and history. But even in the fading light, the house felt wrong. The air was thick, as if the walls themselves were watching. By the time the couple left, the sun had dipped completely below the horizon, leaving the mansion bathed in shadows. Claire locked the door behind them and turned on every light she could find. It was just one night, easy money, but as the hours stretched on, the unease she had felt earlier began to grow. The house groaned and creaked with the shifting of old wood, but some noises didn't seem to belong. A soft rustling in the hallway, the faint sound of footsteps overhead, though she knew the couple had left. She brushed it off as her imagination, the quirks of an old house, until she saw the shadow. Out of the corner of her eye, something flickered across the wall in the living room. She snapped her head toward it, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded as she stared at the spot, waiting, but the shadow didn't return. Just nerves, she told herself. But when she went to the kitchen for a glass of water, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Something was wrong. She felt it. She turned and gasped. A porcelain doll, one she hadn't noticed before, sat on the countertop. Its painted eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. "Nope," she whispered, backing out of the room. She hadn't put it there. She hadn't even seen it during the tour. Her breathing quickened as she returned to the living room, but there too was another doll. This one sat primly on the armrest of the couch, its tiny hands clasped, its eyes watching. By midnight, the house felt alive. Every time Claire turned her back, things shifted. The antique clock on the mantelpiece, silent before, now ticked loudly. The heavy drapes in the dining room seemed to sway as if stirred by an unseen breeze. And the dolls. Oh, the dolls. They were everywhere now. Perched on shelves, nestled in corners, and sitting in chairs as if they'd always been there. She could swear they hadn't been there when she arrived. She avoided looking at them directly, but whenever she glanced away, their positions seemed to change. Her hands trembled as she held her phone, but there was no signal. The Wi-Fi, which had worked earlier, was now inexplicably down. She tried the landline, but the line was dead. Panic set in as she realized she was utterly alone. The floorboards above her creaked again, louder this time. She froze. Those weren't the groans of an old house. They were deliberate, heavy footsteps. Claire's breath hitched as she slowly looked up at the ceiling. The sound stopped directly above her. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Then came the whisper, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a sigh carried on the wind. She whipped around, and her heart nearly stopped. One of the dolls, a larger one with dark curls and a cracked face, was now sitting in the middle of the hallway floor. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as if curious. Claire bolted. She ran down the corridor, her feet pounding against the floor, but no matter where she turned, the dolls seemed to be there, lining the shelves, peeking around corners, sitting on the stairs. Their glassy eyes glinted in the dim light, their tiny faces frozen in eerie, vacant expressions. She stumbled into a bedroom and slammed the door behind her. Her chest heaved as she locked it and braced a chair under the knob. But the relief was short-lived. A scratching sound came from the other side of the door, tiny, insistent. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out. The windows were barred. There was no escape. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her like a weight. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering. The room was suffocatingly dark, the only light coming from a small, antique lamp on the dresser. She caught a flicker of movement in the mirror above it and turned slowly. The dolls were inside the room. They stood in a semicircle, their tiny faces turned toward her. One of them moved, its porcelain head jerking unnaturally as it took a step forward. Then another, and another. Claire screamed and bolted for the door, yanking the chair away and tearing it open. She ran blindly, her vision blurred by tears, until she found the basement door. Without thinking, she threw it open and dashed down the stairs, her feet slipping on the worn wooden steps. The basement was cold, damp, and pitch black. She groped along the wall until she found a light switch. A single, dim bulb flickered to life, casting long, menacing shadows. She spotted a closet in the corner and dove inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands fumbled for a lock, but there was none. The door clicked shut, and she realized too late that it locked automatically from the outside. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she pressed herself against the back wall of the closet. The faint sound of footsteps descended the stairs, not heavy like a person's, but soft, small, like the pitter-patter of tiny feet. The bulb outside the closet door flickered, and she could see their shadows through the gap beneath it. Dozens of them. Then came the voices, whispered, high-pitched and cruel. Another one. She'll be perfect. They always scream. The closet door creaked open. Claire's scream caught in her throat as she saw them, a mass of porcelain faces and claw-like hands reaching for her. She thrashed and kicked, but it was useless. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the large doll with the cracked face, leaning in close, its painted lips twisting into a smile. Above her, the faint sound of laughter echoed. The owner's voices, gleeful and triumphant. She'll make a beautiful addition to the collection. And then silence. The town of Deadville had always been a whispered legend, a cursed name spoken in hushed tones by those brave enough to even acknowledge its existence. Officially, it was a classified, no-go zone, a relic of some government experiment gone catastrophically wrong. But to Alex Reed, an ambitious young newspaper reporter desperate to climb the ranks and finally secure a coveted spot as a news anchor, Deadville was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to uncover the truth and cement his legacy in journalism. Alex stood outside the towering chain-link fence that encircled the desolate town. Rusted barbed wire coiled menacingly along the top, and faded government warning signs dangled limply in the cold night air. Off limits. Trespassers will be prosecuted, one of them read in bold, red letters. The fence itself was weathered, and in the faint moonlight, he spotted what he was looking for, a jagged gap near the base where the metal had been bent outward. Without hesitation, he slid through the opening, his heart pounding in his chest. The mist hit him immediately. Thick and unnatural, it clung to the air like a living thing, reducing his visibility to mere feet in any direction. The world outside the fence seemed to vanish behind him, swallowed by the fog. Alex's flashlight beam wavered, cutting through the gloom, but revealing little more than cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the ground and the occasional distant creak of something unseen shifting in the mist. Deadville had once been a thriving suburban town, but now it felt like a rotting corpse. Buildings loomed like skeletal remains, their windows shattered, their walls blackened with soot and mold. Rusted cars sat abandoned in the streets, their doors gaping open like the mouths of corpses frozen mid-scream. A faint, acrid smell hung in the air, stinging Alex's nostrils and adding to the growing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every hair on his body stood on end, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on him. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on his goal. to gather enough footage and photographs to craft a groundbreaking expose. His camera hung heavy around his neck, and he lifted it to snap a picture of a decaying house with a collapsed roof. The flash illuminated the darkness for a split second, and in that moment, he saw movement. Something darted across the edge of the frame, too fast to identify. Alex froze, his breath hitching. He scanned the shadows with his flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing. "Get a grip, Alex," he muttered under his breath, though his voice sounded small and hollow in the oppressive silence. Still, his pulse quickened, and he couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. He pressed on, weaving through the maze of abandoned streets. The deeper he ventured into Deadville, the heavier the air became, as if the town itself were alive and suffocating him. The mist seemed to thicken, coiling around him like a predator. He stumbled upon a playground, its swings creaking eerily in the still air. The slide was warped and rusted, and a child's doll lay discarded in the dirt, its glass eyes staring blankly at him. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from all directions. Alex's blood turned to ice. He spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam landed on a figure in the distance, barely visible through the fog. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture hunched and unnatural. The skin was pallid and stretched taut over a grotesquely misshapen frame. The creature tilted its head, as if studying him, and then it moved. It didn't walk. It skittered, its movements jerky and insect-like. Alex stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. He fumbled for his camera, snapping a picture in desperation. The flash illuminated the creature for a brief, horrifying instant, revealing rows of jagged teeth and hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. Panic took over. Alex turned and ran, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The streets of Deadville twisted and turned, an endless labyrinth that seemed to shift and change with every step. The mist grew denser, choking him, and the sounds of skittering feet and guttural growls followed him, closing in from all sides. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't dare stop. He burst into a building, slamming the door behind him. The interior was as decrepit as the rest of the town, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered across the floor. He pressed his back against the wall, trying to catch his breath. The growls outside grew louder, more insistent. He glanced around, searching for a weapon, anything to defend himself. His eyes fell on a rusty metal pipe lying among the debris. He grabbed it, his hands shaking. The door rattled violently, and then came the sound of splintering wood. Alex's grip tightened on the pipe as the door burst open, revealing the creature. It was joined by others now, each more grotesque than the last. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their twisted forms oozed malevolence. Alex swung the pipe wildly as they closed in, their guttural growls deafening. The first creature lunged, its claws raking across his arm. Pain exploded through him, and he cried out, stumbling backward. Blood dripped onto the floor, mingling with the dust and grime. He swung again, connecting with one of the creatures, but it barely flinched. Desperation consumed him. He bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. The creatures followed, their unnatural movements allowing them to scale the walls and ceiling with horrifying ease. Alex reached the top floor, bursting into a room with a single shattered window. He was trapped. The creatures advanced, their growls turning into guttural, otherworldly laughter. Alex backed toward the window, his mind racing. The mist outside swirled violently, as if beckoning him. With no other option, He climbed onto the windowsill and looked down. The fall would likely kill him, but staying meant certain death. As the creatures lunged, Alex closed his eyes and jumped. The last thing he saw before the mist swallowed him was the grotesque, leering faces of the creatures peering down from the window. The fall felt endless, the world a swirling void of mist and darkness. And then silence. When Alex opened his eyes, he was no longer in Deadville. Or perhaps he was, but it was different now. The mist was gone, replaced by an endless, black void. The ground beneath him was cold and unyielding, and the oppressive sense of being watched was stronger than ever. Shapes moved in the darkness, their grotesque forms just out of reach. Alex tried to scream, but no sound came out. He realized, with dawning horror, that he hadn't escaped Deadville at all. He had become part of it. The mist began to close in again, suffocating him, as the shapes in the darkness drew closer. Deadville had claimed another victim, and it was hungry for more. The rain lashed against the windows of the train station as Alice clutched her ticket tightly, its edges damp from her sweaty palms. The paper read, "The Midnight Mystery Express," in curling, embossed letters. She had booked it on a whim, desperate to escape the monotony and pressure of her daily life. A murder mystery dinner on a luxurious new train, they had promised. A perfect blend of suspense and indulgence. But as the sleek, dark train rolled into the station, its wheels screeching against the wet tracks, she couldn't shake the faint twinge of unease worming its way into her chest. Stepping aboard, she was met with an overwhelming clash of colors and textures. The decor was garish, the walls lined with velvet curtains in mismatched hues of crimson and gold, chandeliers that seemed far too large swaying slightly with the motion of the train. Tables were draped in heavy brocade, the silverware polished to a blinding gleam. It was opulence turned grotesque. The other passengers, dressed in their finest evening wear, milled about with glasses of champagne, but as Alice approached, no one turned to acknowledge her. She found her seat at the long dining table, set meticulously with gleaming crystal goblets and white porcelain plates edged with gold. The other guests filtered in, taking their places. Laughter and small talk filled the air, but no one looked her way, no one spoke to her. She felt invisible, an unwelcome ghost in the middle of a bustling celebration. The train lurched forward, the sound of the rain mingling with the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. As the dinner began, Alice found herself picking at the lavish meal, her appetite dulled by the mounting sense of wrongness. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and she noticed how the laughter of the other guests seemed hollow, their smiles stretched too wide. Then came the tunnel. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the dining car into complete darkness. The train rattled violently, the sound of the storm outside muffled, but unrelenting. Alice's breath caught in her throat, and she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. A low hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. When the lights snapped back on, a collective gasp choked in her throat. Around her, the other passengers sat slumped in their chairs, their eyes wide and unseeing, their bodies unnaturally still. Blood pooled on the white tablecloth, seeping into the ornate designs. Alice's pulse thundered in her ears as her gaze darted from one lifeless body to the next. This was no staged performance. This was real. A scream clawed its way up her throat, but she swallowed it down, her instincts screaming at her to stay quiet. She pushed herself up from the table, her legs trembling beneath her, and stumbled toward the door at the end of the car. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. She glanced back once, and the sight of those lifeless figures sent a shiver racing down her spine. The next car was eerily quiet, rows of empty seats stretching before her. The dim, flickering lights cast elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. She pressed forward, her breathing shallow, her steps quickening. She passed through another car, and another, each one darker, colder, more suffocating than the last. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her chest, and her own footsteps echoed back at her, mocking her solitude. Then she heard it. A faint, deliberate sound. Footsteps, slow, measured, and far too close. Her heart hammered as she turned to look behind her, but the corridor was empty. Still, the sound grew louder, closing the distance with an agonizing slowness. She broke into a run, the sound of her own footsteps mixing with the pursuing echoes. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred, but she couldn't stop. The oppressive sense of being hunted consumed her. She flung herself into a small alcove between cars, pressing her back against the cold metal wall, her hands shaking uncontrollably. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and distorted, and her breath hitched. The silhouette of a figure loomed at the end of the corridor, its shape indistinct, but undeniably human. It moved closer, deliberate and unhurried, as if it knew there was no escape. The air around her seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, a palpable malice that seeped into her skin. Alice's vision swam, the edges darkening. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed, the world tilting around her. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was the figure's featureless face, a void where eyes and a mouth should have been. When she woke, she was back at the dining table. The room was pristine, the tablecloth spotless, the guests alive and animated. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air once more. For a brief, disorienting moment, she thought she had imagined it all. But then she looked down. In her hand, she held a knife. The blade was slick with blood, droplets falling onto her lap, staining the white napkin draped there. Whispers swirled around her, soft and insidious, their words unintelligible, but filled with an unmistakable command. "Do it again," they seemed to say, the voices coiling around her mind like smoke. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she dropped the knife, the clang of metal against the floor echoing unnaturally loud. The guests turned to her then, their faces wrong, their eyes empty, their smiles too wide. And then she remembered. The memories came rushing back like a tidal wave. The rage, the knife, the blood. She had been here before, countless times. This was her punishment, her hell. She had murdered them all years ago, in a fit of madness, and now she was trapped, doomed to relive the horror over and over, each loop more unbearable than the last. The train plunged into darkness once more, and Alice's scream was swallowed by the void. The sprawling factory sat cloaked in shadows, its towering smokestacks stabbing into the starless night sky. Amelia Parsons had orchestrated this moment meticulously, her career a crescendo of success and ambition that now led her here. The glass labyrinth, she called it, a labyrinth of mirrors, her magnum opus, a reflection of her brilliance and self-made triumph. But tonight, as she walked the eerie corridors alone, her heels clicking against the concrete floor, she felt a peculiar heaviness. The mirrors rose like sentinels on either side of her, their surfaces unnaturally clean, as if waiting to swallow her image whole. The air tasted metallic, sharp and biting against her tongue. She glanced over her shoulder, her reflection repeating infinitely behind her, faces in the glass growing more distorted the farther back they stretched. She shook off the unease. "Nerves," she whispered to herself. though her voice faltered. Amelia never got nervous. Not anymore. Her steps slowed as the sound of glass creaking reached her ears. It was faint at first, like the groan of a distant ship. Then it intensified, an agonized wail that seemed to echo from the mirrors themselves. She spun around, her breath catching. The mirrors didn't just reflect her, they watched. Her own face stared back, but something about the eyes was wrong. Too wide, too hollow. A cold pressure pressed against her chest, invisible hands shoving her backward. She stumbled, slamming into the glass. Her reflection split into shards that swirled like a kaleidoscope before snapping back into place. Amelia gasped, her heartbeat a deafening roar in her ears. She reached out to steady herself, but the mirror beneath her palm was warm and pulsing, like flesh. A scream built in her throat as the labyrinth began to shift. The walls closed in, their reflective surfaces rippling like disturbed water. Her image fractured and multiplied, reflections of her panic-stricken face spinning around her. The air grew thicker, suffocating, as if the factory had become a living thing, feeding on her fear. Amelia tried to run, but the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She was dragged, pulled into the maze deeper, mirrors opening and closing like jaws. Her screams echoed endlessly, bouncing off the glass and returning to her distorted, mangled. Somewhere, far across town, a needle twisted into a tiny cloth doll, its limbs jerking to life. Maggie Roberts sat cross-legged on the floor of her dimly lit apartment, the flickering candlelight casting grotesque shadows on the walls. In her lap rested the doll, a crude, ugly thing, its fabric stained with years of resentment and rage. A single strand of Amelia's golden hair was knotted into its head, and its painted eyes glimmered with malicious intent. She traced a finger along the doll's arm, memories slithering into her mind like vipers. Years ago, Amelia had been her best friend. They were inseparable in college, sharing secrets, dreams, and an unshakable bond. But that bond had snapped the moment Amelia took what was Maggie's. Maggie had loved Ben with a quiet, devoted intensity. He was kind, warm, and everything she had ever wanted. And Amelia? Amelia had known. She had laughed with Maggie about their future together, had encouraged Maggie to confess her feelings, and then, with her effortless charm, Amelia had stolen him. It started with flirtations disguised as innocent jokes, lingering touches that should have meant nothing. Maggie saw the way Ben's eyes began to follow Amelia instead of her, the way he leaned in closer when Amelia spoke, the way Maggie became invisible. The final betrayal came at a party, one Maggie hadn't even attended. She had stayed in that night, too exhausted from school to go out. But Amelia and Ben had gone, and in the morning, everything was different. Ben wouldn't meet Maggie's eyes, and Amelia? She didn't need to say a word. The smirk on her lips, the possessive way she rested her hand on Ben's arm, told Maggie everything she needed to know. Maggie had flunked out of college soon after. She couldn't concentrate, couldn't stomach watching the two of them parade their happiness in front of her. They got married. Amelia climbed the ladder of success, her artistic career skyrocketing, while Maggie was left behind, drowning in bitterness, in resentment, in thoughts that festered and rotted until they became something else entirely, something hungry. Her fingers moved methodically, her nails long and cracked, twisting the doll's limbs. Across town, she could feel it, the tug of her while dragging Amelia deeper into her creation. Maggie's lips curved into a grim smile. "You always wanted to be the center of attention," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the candles. "Now you'll have an audience forever." She twisted the doll's torso, And somewhere in the labyrinth, Amelia's body twisted violently, her screams vibrating through the mirrors. Maggie could almost hear them, a symphony of agony that soothed the years of bitterness lodged in her heart. Each flick of her fingers sent Amelia sprawling, crashing into the glass that now imprisoned her. Days turned to weeks, and Amelia's disappearance became another unsolved mystery. The glass labyrinth was cordoned off, its shimmering corridors silent now, though locals whispered of strange sounds at night. Faint cries, the tap of footsteps that came from nowhere. Maggie waited. She bided her time until the whispers faded and the factory grew cold and forgotten. Then, under the cover of night, she broke in. The mirrors loomed around her as she navigated the maze, her reflection trailing her every move. But there was no fear in Maggie's eyes, only grim satisfaction. She knew what she was looking for, and then she saw it. Amelia's face stared back at her from within the glass, her hands pressed against the surface as if she could claw her way out. Her mouth moved, but no sound escaped. Her eyes, once full of arrogance and ambition, were now wide with terror, pleading. Maggie stepped closer, tilting her head as she studied her former friend. She placed her hand against the glass, mirroring Amelia's. "You should have been more careful who you stepped on," she murmured. Her voice was steady, devoid of pity. Amelia's lips formed the word, "Please." Maggie smiled. She pulled a bat from the bag slung over her shoulder. With a calculated swing, she shattered the mirror into 1,000 glittering pieces. The shards rained down, catching the light like stars before settling into darkness. Amelia's scream echoed faintly, then vanished. Maggie exhaled, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hi, Ben," she said sweetly when the line connected. "It's been a while. Want to grab coffee? Catch up?" Her smile widened as she hung up, the broken glass crunching beneath her feet. Behind her, the remaining mirrors shimmered faintly, as if watching her leave. The factory fell silent, but the air remained heavy, oppressive, as if something lingered, something waiting. The dim glow of the desk lamp cast long, quivering shadows across the room as Ethan Graves, celebrated horror novelist, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He was one chapter away from completing his latest novel, a masterpiece of terror, and yet, for the past few months, an inexplicable sense of dread had clawed at the edges of his mind. He had seen the shadow. Tonight was no different. The soft hum of his security system suddenly crackled to life, sending a cold spear of adrenaline through his veins. He turned to the monitor, heart hammering in his chest. There, just beyond the wrought iron gates of his secluded estate, a dark figure stood motionless, its shape indistinct, shifting, as if the night itself had taken form. The figure had no face, only a void of nothingness. Ethan swallowed hard. The gates were locked. They had always been locked, but it didn't matter. He reached for his whiskey, the ice clinking against the glass as he downed it in one burning gulp. The shadow had appeared before. It never stayed for long, just long enough to remind him that it was watching. The screen flickered. The figure was gone. Dread coiled in his stomach like a nest of writhing snakes. He reached for the bottle, poured another glass, and swallowed 2 sleeping pills dry. His body felt heavy, his vision blurred. The world spiraled into darkness. Then, silence. Ethan awoke with a start, his breath ragged. Something was wrong. The air was thick, oppressive, humming with an unnatural energy. He was in his bedroom, yet it wasn't his bedroom. The walls, once adorned with rich mahogany panels, were now gnarled, twisted like the bones of something long dead. The chandelier above hung like a rotten carcass, dripping with something thick and black. The air smelled of decay. He staggered to his feet. The mansion was wrong. Shadows moved along the walls, creeping, watching. His breath hitched as he stepped into the hall, the floor creaking beneath his weight. The long corridor stretched impossibly far, warping and shifting like something alive. A distant sound, a whisper of laughter, guttural and hollow, echoed in the void. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from the darkness. Familiar faces twisted in agony, flesh peeling, eyes hollow sockets of torment. He knew them. He had created them. They were the victims of his stories, the ones he had condemned to fates worse than death. And now they wanted him. Ethan turned and ran, his heartbeat a thunderous roar in his ears. The mansion folded around him, twisting corridors into a labyrinth of nightmares. He stumbled into a vast chamber, his study, but transformed. The floor was no longer wood, but a massive chessboard, stretching into an abyss of darkness. A grotesque night piece shifted, its obsidian blade gleaming. The game had begun. Ethan moved cautiously, sweat dripping from his brow. The pieces stirred, eyeless statues that jerked and twitched with unnatural spasms. He took a step. The air vibrated. A rook lunged, its spiked form crashing down where he had just stood. He leaped forward, dodging, his breath ragged. Each move was a gamble. Each misstep could mean death. The path to escape was closing. His pulse pounded. He made his move. Checkmate. The pieces froze. Silence swallowed the room. Then, a shadow unfurled in front of him, rising, solidifying into a figure. Ethan staggered back. He knew that silhouette. The dark figure from the gate. The presence that had haunted him for months. It stepped closer, the dim light revealing its face, his own face, a perfect mirror, but wrong. Eyes black voids, lips curled into a sinister smirk. It was him, yet not him, a twisted reflection. A doppelganger birthed from the horrors he had penned. The air grew suffocating. The figure grinned wider, leaning in. "You wrote me," it rasped, voice dripping with malice. "And now, I will write you." Darkness surged. Ethan screamed. Then silence. The next morning, his publisher called. Ethan's manuscript had arrived. Complete. Perfect. But Ethan Graves was never seen again. The cold mountain air bit at Cassandra's skin as she stepped out of her sleek black SUV, staring up at the looming log cabin. The structure was massive yet isolated, swallowed by an expanse of gnarled trees and whispering winds. It was exactly what she wanted. No fans, no cameras, no expectations. Just her, the script, and her relentless pursuit of perfection. She had fought tooth and nail for this role. The horror movie about Bloody Mary was set to be the next big blockbuster, and Cassandra needed to be the best upcoming actress in Hollywood. She had already built a reputation for pushing herself to the extreme for her roles, and this was no different. To fully embody the part, she had chosen this remote retreat, isolating herself to focus without distraction. She had to channel Bloody Mary's torment, her rage, her presence. She wasn't just going to act the part, she was going to become her. This role would be her breakout moment, and she refused to let anything stand in her way. The cabin's interior was just as grand as she had hoped, adorned with high wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and dim, flickering lanterns. She set her suitcase by the door and made her way to the grand bathroom. a Gothic sanctuary of dark tiles, and an antique clawfoot tub. A mirror, wide and aged with an ornate gold frame, stretched across the wall. It was perfect. As the night deepened, shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, the wind's howls creeping under the cabin's eaves like sinister whispers. Cassandra stood before the mirror, script clutched in white-knuckled fingers, rehearsing in a voice barely above a whisper. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, she inhaled sharply, forcing herself to meet her reflection. The dim light cast eerie hollows under her eyes. Her pulse drummed in her ears, but nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. It was just a legend. Yet, as she turned away, something stirred. A movement, slight yet deliberate, in the corner of her vision. Her breath hitched, spine stiffening. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror. Her reflection hadn't moved, but something stood behind it. A figure, draped in shadow and malice, with empty, bleeding sockets where eyes should be. Lips blackened and twisted into something that was neither a grin nor a grimace. A clawed, skeletal hand rose, fingers curling as if beckoning. A choked gasp escaped Cassandra's throat, but her body remained frozen, trapped in the gaze of the impossible. The mirror darkened, its surface rippling like disturbed water. Then, with a sickening shatter, it burst outward. She stumbled back, shards slicing her bare arms as a guttural, otherworldly wail erupted from the broken glass. The thing, Bloody Mary, slithered forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it were being dragged by unseen strings. Cassandra ran. Down the hall, through the darkened cabin, her own panicked breaths deafening her. The air grew thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves closed in, squeezing the breath from her lungs. A shadow loomed ahead. The doorway, her escape. The air behind her shifted. Cold fingers brushed the nape of her neck. She screamed, lunging for the door. Her trembling hands fumbled with the lock, the sensation of something just inches away, stretching, reaching, clawing. The door flung open, and she stumbled outside into the freezing night. Snow crunched beneath her as she bolted for the SUV, her legs screaming in protest. The engine roared to life as she slammed her foot onto the gas, the tires skidding against the icy driveway. The cabin shrank in her rearview mirror, swallowed by the encroaching dawn. Her pulse pounded in her skull, hands clenched tight around the wheel. She dared a glance up. The mirror. A face, gaunt and bloodied, its mouth stretching into an unholy grin. Eyes empty, black, endless, locked onto hers. A whisper, soft and sweet, slid into her ears like silk-wrapped razors. "You can't escape me." Cassandra screamed as the car fishtailed, the reflection vanishing as she careened down the mountain road, the sun's first light chasing the darkness away. But deep in her bones, she knew it wasn't over. It would never be over.